Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jamie Costa. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the Gallery Experience Associate at the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery. We're thrilled to present today's program with Panteha Abareshi in conjunction with their solo exhibition, Tender Calamities, which is on view at lamag.org through April 22nd. Before I introduce Panteha, I have a few housekeeping bits I just wanted to go over. First, please make sure your microphone is muted during the speaker's presentation. We'll have a few minutes toward the end of the program for a Q&A, so please enter any questions you have directly into the chat box, or if you feel comfortable with taking yourself off mute at that point, you're more than welcome to ask Panteha your question directly. And as a reminder, this program is being recorded so that it can be made available at a later date on Lamag's website. And we have live captioning available, which the stream text is in the chat if you need it. And we're also very fortunate to have sign language interpreter services today that has been provided to us by the Department on Disability. If you requested sign language interpreter services, I recommend pinning their screen to your window for easier access. And with that, I am truly honored to introduce Panteha Abareshi. Panteha Abareshi's they, them work draws from their personal experience of grappling with the abstraction of many seen and unseen qualities of chronic health issues stemming from the genetic condition sickle cell zero beta thalassemia. Abareshi's performance-based multidisciplinary approach boldly addresses the complexities of living within a body that is highly monitored, constantly examined, and sometimes made to feel like a specimen. Abareshi's endurance-defying performances pushes the body to and often beyond its prescribed limits. The risks in these performances posture an objectification of their own corporeal form to continue an examination of bodily deterioration, touching on the reciprocity and themes of universal fragility, fear, pain, and mortality. Panteha Abareshi holds a BFA from the University of Southern California's Roski School of Art and Design. Abareshi has performed and exhibited at the Institute of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles, Human Resources, Los Angeles, and the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery, among others.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for the introduction, and thank you to the interpreters and captioners today. I just want to, again, extend my extreme gratitude for that. So if any of you were here for last week's program, I spoke sort of about the work that I made and the practice that went into it and sort of examinations of self and reflexivity within that. And this week I'm discussing sort of something more specific within the work and within my practice, which is the examination of the erotics of the disabled body. And this is an ongoing sort of body of thought for me. I made this work thinking about this, and I'm going to share all of my thought around that with you today, but it's something that I'm still really thinking about, really contemplating. It's immensely complex, and it's also something that I haven't fully articulated to myself yet, which is unique, so because a lot of times, most of the time, when I'm going into making work, I feel as though I'm making the work because I fully articulated what I want to say to myself first, and now I want to sort of put that into a piece of work. With this, I'm still navigating the erotics of my own body, what my relationship is to the sexualization and sensualization of not just me, but my illness and my disability, and how all of those things are constantly interplaying. And what they say in the larger context about our relationships sociologically and societally to sex and the disabled body and those intersections. So it's a broad scope of things, of course, but today I'm going to be sort of focusing on the ways in which it sort of comes out in my work and my practice. So I'll start sharing my screen, and if you have questions, put them in the chat. I think Jamie may have said this, and then at the end, I'll really be happy to sort of answer questions and to have a sort of discussion around anything that you want me to elaborate more on, of course. Yeah, so I just want to start off by sort of talking about the act of looking, which I talk a lot about in my work, but specifically with the tender calamities, there is a lot of sort of the invitation to look, and that sort of arises from being hyper aware of that dynamic in my earlier work, but wanting to sort of expand that criticality and think about within every gaze, within every distinct act of looking, what are the sort of implicit hierarchies that are being enacted and that people are engaging in. And I say implicit and explicit because there are explicit hierarchies between the disabled body and the able body, the sick body and the healthy body, all of those being, cautiously put into air quotation marks. But there are hierarchies that we can superficially examine. And those hierarchies, of course, stem from pre-existing sort of systems of ableism, but implicit hierarchies are the ones that I'm more fascinated in. And those really sort of breach into the area of the taboo nature of the sensualization and eroticization of the body. What is this subconscious eroticization that's happening, and what happens when people tentatively sort of verbalize that? Again, sort of in my earlier work, and I'll show some stills in the next slides, but what is it about this body that is proclaiming itself to be in pain, that is documenting itself in pain, and that is sort of pushing a hyper vulnerability in the context of sort of disability and decrepitness, and really examining deterioration that invites an inherent sexualization and eroticization? Is it just because it's a naked body that is being coded and read as female? And simply yes, but in a much more complex way. It's so much more than that. Of course, we are brought up with language, socio-sexual language, that invites this inherent objectification of the body, regardless of its proclamations about disability or its identifications as such. But when you bring those things into the mix is what is most fascinating to me, because layering our relationship to the sick body and the disabled body into our sort of pre-existing, very complicated, very skewed perceptions of the body as an erotic object, it really gives way to this, what I think is a really sort of what am I trying to say? Like fertile ground for discussion. Excuse the use of fertile, it's such a loaded word in itself. But the idea of power and powerlessness, and I'm probably going to come back to this a lot, but what is this, this need that I felt in my work to sort of exercise control? And this is a slide from my first talk, because I want to come back to this, the idea of exercising control. And this idea that I was creating work that was heavily driven by these specific experiences, and to process these sort of complex things. And then as I was presenting the work, I was being faced with a eroticization of my body from the point of the viewer and from the point of the bodies interacting with this work that initially really took me off guard. I expressed this earlier, but I'll elaborate on it further. I have these sort of very hyper bodily exhaustive performances that are a dialogue between myself and my inability, my body and its pain, my sickness and my disability, all of these things sort of being compounded into these really taxing, really exhaustive performances. And they're in these medicalized contexts, they're framed around the body as a disabled thing. And yet there is an eroticization and a sensualization that's being brought to the shape of this body, to the body as a vulnerable thing. And the response that I was getting, as I said, initially made me, it's too simple to say it made me uncomfortable, but it was very intriguing to sort of have people posing the questions of, is this erotic? Is this sexual? And the sort of simple naive thing for me to do would be to say no, and then to sort of explain what my intention was, which is pointless, you know, to negate someone's reading of the work and then, you know, sort of overlay that with what my true intention was. But it's more fascinating to sort of say, okay, let's invite a discussion around this, you know, what is it within our, so again, socio-sexual upbringing and the language that we are given both around sex and around illness, that when these two things compound, one, we're at a complete loss of words as to how to sort of articulate the feelings that this is evoking. But then when we sort of delve into it, it is easily reduced to a sort of, I see a naked body, I code that body as female. It is in this sort of splayed, vulnerable, objectified position. What is not there to sort of, you know, invite an inherent sexualization? And to that I say, sure. But what is it then when it compounds with illness? The body in the wheelchair, the body that is immobilized, you know, so in this new body of work in Tender Calamities, there is a really strong and sort of forward pushing presentation of the body as an object that's inviting in these gazes then as a means to sort of, you know, foster this sort of criticality around it. And, you know, now to sort of get into the theory of it all that I'm always thinking about and so excited to share with people. I want to take a step back and sort of look at the need for care and what we associate immediately with a sick and disabled body, one that is coded as such, one that is proclaiming itself as such, all of these things. Because the need for care is conflated with the sick body, the decrepit body, the dying body. And a body that's exhibiting its vulnerability is a body that is expressing its need for care. And, you know, I try not to let myself go off on these tangents because I could just talk and talk and talk. But, you know, later on in the piece Methods of Care that I'll show, thinking about what it is in our language that we have around illness that proclaims that the able-bodied individual knows what is best for the sick body more so than the sick body does. These decisions around health, this sort of linear pathway between health and sickness, where a body has to always be sort of striving to achieve a standard of able-bodiedness, and all of that being sort of wrapped up into what care is. Caring for a sick body is doing everything that you can to make that sick body healthy by your standards, to make that disabled body able-bodied by your standards. Super complicated, super, you know, layered and frustrating and all of these things. I'll get to that, but I want to sort of examine the sort of literal physical assistance that the body needs, help bathing, help eating, help, you know, going to the bathroom, help changing, all of these things that I personally experience, you know, in my most sort of vulnerable states, in the moments when my health is precluding me the most, immobilizing me the most. And this need for physical assistance, this need for care is linked, of course, to the idea of dependency then. And, you know, within that, there is this really interesting notion of infantilization. Both, you know, I'll speak first about the infantilization of the sick and disabled body, because, you know, we think about caring for a body, and it is, you know, has this sort of very maternal element to it. And I don't want to, you know, it's reductive now, I think, to sort of approach this from the perspective of purely maternal, you know, the connotations of the maternal care. So, you know, maternal and parental, I'll say. But, you know, there is this feminization within care that's really important to acknowledge as well. And I'll, you know, talk about then, of course, the sort of the castration of the sick body, but also the sort of feminization and degradation of the caregiver as well. And that interesting dynamic. But let me slow my roll. Let me take this one step at a time, one bullet point at a time. And so the care of the sick and disabled body, I think, you know, from examining this, is sort of idealized as maternal, as non-sexual, and the conflation of care and sexuality then, or sexuality in a way that is autonomous and not sort of projected and not sort of objectifying, is really anxiety inducing, because, you know, I apologize for bringing Freud into this. I really hate doing that. But I think this concept of infantile sexuality is really interesting to me personally. One of the few times I'll say that about Freud again, I apologize, but this idea that an innate sexuality exists within the child. And, that's an interesting concept when you're thinking about the adult disabled body being infantilized and that being a barrier one to its treatment as an autonomous sort of person, not just a thing, but also the barriers that are posed then in sort of it's in the confusing nature of its sexualization. And so thinking that there's a sort of a taboo around a child being sexualized, and so does that transfer then to a disabled body being sexualized? And I won't spend too much time talking about this idea of the mother as a love object, but the idea that to emerge into adult sexuality, one must sort of repress this infantile sexuality. And then I think thinking through this framework of the infantile sexuality and the sort of repression of that in adult sexuality, it's really interesting to then look at physical care being eroticized and the early connections between care and pleasure that might exist through a sort of Freudian analysis of the young body that is being cared for. That is a helpless thing, deriving pleasure from its care, from the care that its mother is giving it. It's a sort of, it's the frameworks in which you can approach this from are vast and complicated, but I think that this, for me, this Freudian analysis of this just sort of serves to show, one, that human sexuality is something that we really have such a lack of a grasp on fundamentally, and that you can posit this sort of complicated, tumbling path from infanthood to adulthood as it relates to the sexualization of the disabled body. And it's a theory that I believe is very interesting and valuable, but it also shows that like we are really constructing as we go the languages that we need to fill in the answers for the biggest confusions that we have around sex, sexuality, and the sort of root of those taboos that we are confronting within ourselves. This is just, one of the many complicated paths that you can take to explore why we are so uncomfortable with the disabled body being sexualized. Thought I would share that because, it's fascinating to me, frustrating to me at the same time. But it allows me to sort of, move on to this idea of examining control within care. And this comes up within the work that I will show you. And returning to the question, as I said here, about what drives sexualization of a body that is broken down. And again, I think it's really important to be critical of the language that we have around erotics, around bodies, and around their vulnerability. Three places that we are, like, as a species, as people who are speaking the English language, we must admit that there is a great deficit. We don't have a very broad emotional language around things that are, even sort of normative in terms of like the languages we have around intimacy, the languages we have around sex and sexuality and its nuances and its complications and its sort of its depth within us. There's something inherently superficial about the way we are taught to face these things, and it, as people learn, it takes a great amount of sort of effort to sort of delve into the complexities of one's own sexual identification. And then again, once that starts intersecting with all these other things that we don't have language for, such as illness, it just becomes something that we're sort of floundering to articulate. And then we find ourselves posed with a body that we are eroticizing, that is disabled, and we don't have the language that we need to talk about that. And that's sort of what I'm trying to like combat through this work and through talking about it today and through sort of encouraging people to be thinking about it in this way. And then, I think it's interesting then to talk about the idea of the public and the private. And this idea of sex being relegated to the private sphere, even in sort of an age of what one might define as burgeoning sex positivity, there is this still notion of sex being something that is inherently private. And the sexual experience of the sick and disabled body really reveals how fragile this boundary is, and sort of how constructed this boundary between something that is private and something that is public in. Because, as I said, sex is relegated to the private sphere, but for the disabled body, the zones of the body that are, coded as sexual, the body itself is being pulled into the public sphere, being handled publicly. And this is an important place to acknowledge the role that medicalization and scientific examination of the sick and disabled body actually plays into its sexualization and eroticization. The medical gaze and the medical touch are really interestingly sort of conflated with the disabled experience and the way that we perceive the disabled and sick body as being handled and as sort of moving through society, operating within society, certainly inherently linked to the hospital as an institution. And it's interesting because, I have spent a great deal of time in the hospital. I will continue to spend a great deal of time in the hospital. And the idea of medical professionalism really hinges upon, well, I'll back up and I'll say that, the disabled body being handled publicly. You think about care within the hospital, doctors and nurses, rehabilitators, physical therapists, people who are otherwise working at the hospital charged with the cleaning of the body, the cleaning of the medical space. These are all strangers, who are tasked with handling the sick and disabled body and its secretions, its outputs, its emotions. All of that is being handled by quote unquote strangers. And again, medical professionalism hinging on the ability of the medical professional to sort of invade the privacy of the disabled body while being divorced from sort of the sexual associations of that. And it's a complicated thing that is really difficult to discuss, sexualization within the hospital. And it's complex. It's extremely complex. I have only just transferred to adult care from being in the long time in the children's pediatric sort of medical sphere. And I stayed there for so long into adulthood because because of the highly sort of like specific needs of my condition and sort of rareness of it. When I find a hematologist that can care for me and knows or proclaims to knows what's best for me and sort of like can create a regimen for me, it's hard to sort of leave that and start a new practice of care. It's a really difficult thing. But the adult body existing within the children's hospital specifically provides a really interesting lens, again, between this relationship between infantilization and sickness and illness, but a disabled body in a pediatric context that is adult and that is being treated as such, but in an unspoken way through gendering and through sexualization. It's an uncomfortable thing to navigate because I would find my body being handled by strangers of all genders. But there is this feminization, I'm being coded as female, I'm being treated as female. So asking male doctors to leave the room so that I can change, or, this idea that there is, that the male gaze is being acknowledged, but not acknowledged enough to sort of to sort of tackle that dynamic between my body and the male doctors handling it. And it's all this sort of unspoken coding and violence that's happening that really makes this extremely frustrating to talk about, because we don't have a framework to be discussing this. It's very fascinating to me, and I want to be having these discussions, but it's inappropriate and uncalled for, or not uncalled for, but unexpected and unsupported to sort of have these discussions in the medical context. I can't talk about my inane sexualization with the nurses tasked with my care. And so it's up to me then in my practice and sort of alone in the sounding chamber of my mind to really delve into this criticality around it. And it comes down to this idea that the public and private sphere is a privilege not afforded to the sick and disabled. It's an immense privilege to have privacy. It's a privilege that is afforded to the white, the rich, the cisgendered, the heterosexual, and it goes into class, it goes into race, it goes into all of these things. But the idea that an othered body, in any way that it's othered, has no agency ultimately over its relegation to privacy, that it can be pulled into the public to be examined, to be dissected, to be discussed at the whim of those exercising hierarchical privilege over it, is important because it pertains to sexuality in the stripping of agency from the sick and disabled body when it comes to its eroticization. The sick and disabled body isn't something that we see as exercising sexual agency. It's something that can be sexualized, but not of its own accord. And so that is the interesting power dynamic within it that I'm really fascinated with, this idea of, tackling and grappling with your own sexuality at the hands of those who are sexualizing you, not at the hands of your of yourself, sexualizing yourself. And so it gets complicated then when I'm, making work that's sort of battling that, because it's like, is this an auto-sexualization? Perhaps it's certainly an auto-objectification, and then what is the line between objectification and sexualization? Super interesting to think about for me. But this is the piece Methods of Care for the Precarious Body. For those who are unfamiliar with it, I'll just quickly explain. I did a performance sort of like decking myself out in these medical restraints, sort of step by step, and then medical restraints, and then sort of industrial restraints, not really meant to be used on the body, shackling my wrists together, shackling my ankles together. And this sort of restrictive stripping of control being proclaimed as a method of care for the precarious body, thinking about the immobilization of the body, the stripping of its agency as the sort of pinnacle way that you can care for it. The only way to take care of a sick and disabled body is to strip it of its control and do what's best for it. That's, the sort of the approach of this piece, and it has this interesting element of the disabled body looking at itself, objectifying itself, running through this projector. It's like a projection within the video, it's sort of like old school Kodak carousel projector. So all of that, the looking, the auto objectification, but within that, there are, underlying and certainly implicit themes of BDSM, and the idea of the body bound and the body restrained as a way of taking care of it. And it's this interesting balance between control as care and the body. What is the agency of the body in this situation? It's certainly an important question to ask in this work. How autonomous is this disabled body in its proclamation of this method of its care, when really it's sort of also, any sort of exercising of control that a disabled body has is within the framework of able-bodied control over it. So it's like care within a larger scope of care, control within a larger scope of control. But this idea of binding the body, restricting the body, stripping the body of its agency, assigning this sort of hyper objectification to a body as a means of caring for it exists within BDSM, especially sort of early practices of BDSM in a time where a lot of the movement was to combat the the chastising and the actual, legal repression of homosexuality and sexual otherness. But you think about these coded images, restraints, as they interface with race, as they interface with illness. But what does it mean to shackle a body and then proclaim that you are taking care of it? And there is again this question of sensuality and eroticization. I think more so eroticization, because it pertains to the body as a fetish object in this case, where the body is presenting itself as this thing that no longer has any control and is completely sort of at your whim, the whim of the viewer. The viewer who has been now, after this, they watch this piece, instructed on how to strip the body of its agency as a means of taking care of it. The question is, what then do you do with this object, this body as object? And there's a lot of sort of power that is inserted into that, and then with that, of course, eroticization, and that interesting moment where when you can exercise power over something, you can also sort of exercise an eroticizing gaze and a fetishizing gaze onto it. That's sort of universally true for the way we move through the world and the way we interact with things we can exercise control over. But in this context, I think I was really excited to make this work and to sort of put all of that into there. Whew, sorry, I have to take a break. I'm like talking and talking and talking. But yeah, so I also sort of want to talk about heteronormativity and the heteronormative power imbalance, and that care and help sort of relies on that. And I mentioned this earlier, the feminization of care, both in the feminizing infantilization of the sick and disabled body and sort of needing help, but also the feminization of the caregiver and the sort of someone who is complicit and compliant in the caring of a body and the sort of service to a body in this way is engaging in a dynamic of subordination in sort of simple terms, and sort of examining weakness and power, not only on the part of the body, but on the part then of someone that is proclaiming to care for a body, to want to take care of a body, all of these things in a way that is not explicitly sterile. So you breach that hyper personal, sort of intimate space within a sick and disabled body, and the taboo is skyrocketed. It's really inflamed, because we don't, again, have a sort of sociological, societal language around what a normal health, quote unquote normal, again, super loaded, but how we're able to sort of examine a relationship between an able body and a sick body, or an able body and a disabled body, that isn't fitting within the confines of these power dynamics that are, really sort of degrading to both parties. And so all of these things, all these visual languages, these verbal languages, written languages that we have around illness, really push for the body to be relegated back into the sterile zone, because that's where we feel most comfortable with disability existing. And so with sexualization that is, sort of being broken away from only on the part of the able-bodied viewer, it becomes uncomfortable, and the sick and disabled body is sexualizing itself, or when it's inviting in a more nuanced sexualization on the part of a romantic partner or an intimate partner, and when the body is exercising autonomy in the way that it's moving through the world, we get so immensely uncomfortable. And that's because, of course, the body is breaking away from its role as object, and it's inflammatory, and that's exciting to me, interesting to me, I think, really worth examining. And this is my other video piece as part of Tender Calamities, Unlearn the Body. And in this piece, I think there's sort of a nod to this question of autonomy, or a body that is, again, within the systems that it's allowed, exercising a sort of control of its image, but a body, again, that is still bound, a body that is unlearning itself, a body that is breaking away from the ableist standards that dictate its existence, still through modes that involve binding and controlling and sort of constriction of the body, always operating within these ideas of confinement and restraint. Because, again, one, that speaks for me conceptually to the way that the sick and disabled body works, but also really thinking about what, on the part of the sick and disabled body, its relationship is to the way it's being cared for. What is it that a body wants, and is that worth examining even, but these really complicated images of a body that is bound, a body that is tied, a body that is, is so extremely vulnerable, a body that is depersonalized, all of these things. It's really important to capture in this sort of piece that is about unlearning the definitions of the body and really letting the body wax between object and corporeal sort of living thing, this complicated idea of existence that is not biological, not machine, this body that is not able to adhere to the bodily standards of a human able body, in its malfunction and its prosthesis, but that is not advanced enough technologically to be cyborg and to sort of be object, to sort of be futurist. And so it's this body in limbo, this body that exists without definition, and this body that is sort of flailing to identify itself while being under the extremely excruciating gaze that is imbuing sexuality and imbuing fetishism into it, and being hyper aware of that, not being allowed to look at the camera, not being allowed that identification, examining the aesthetics of the body, being aware of that as well, being aware that the body is being objectified and is being then, inherently assigned an aesthetic. And so looking at the body as sculpture, looking at the body as material, all of these things, really this depersonalization that I'm really fascinated with in my work is really important to me, comes from all of this, comes from a really, really strenuous examination of erotics and of sensualization, but then, of course, sort of more grounded discussions of what empowerment looks like, such a complicated thing. And I think that that's always going to be a complicated discussion for me to have. I wouldn't go, I never claim that my work is empowering to me or anyone else, because I think it's the reason I make the work is because it's disempowering. I think that it's really important to me to acknowledge the sort of power imbalances, the lack of power, lack of control, and using that as a way of sort of not empowering the body, but emancipating the body from definitions that it exists under, and really looking at how important that is for me personally, and you know, on a larger scale of the way that we're interacting with bodies that are othered. And, you know, again, the idea of a body that's broken down, like what is this, what do these images invite? And, you know, again, I'm very now critical of that, coming from work where I wasn't being critical about that at all, into work where every frame I'm sort of really thinking about that. And then, you know, what I've started calling sort of the problem body, and thinking about the disabled body as a problem body, but using that as a larger term that really applies to othered bodies that just like do not fit into the frameworks and the structures that we have to define existence, to define bodies. And as I said here, the sort of really important relationship between othering a body and eroticizing it, fetishizing it. We other something, we ostracize something, and yet we develop an innate fascination with its eroticization because it becomes fetish object in its othered realm. We can imbue all of our insecurities, all of our confusions, all of our frustrations with the otherness of this body, what within its otherness we see in ourselves. All of that is condensed and compounded into it as a fetish object. And I think that that is very fascinating, of course. Again, taking a break, you know, wet the throat and talking nonstop. But here I've put a little bullet point that says the problem body in relationship to capitalism. And, you know, it's hard to keep this discussion concise and to keep it focused, because it so easily branches out into the ways in which we are moving through the world. And, you know, the commodification of a body, the commodification of emotion, of experience, is so pivotal in the way that we're coding bodies. And, you know, the theory of the problem body as something that is distinctly, you know, contradicting the systems in which we are meant to sort of move through without questioning, really brings up the issue of the disabled body, the othered body, as a body that does not function seamlessly within the capitalist apparatus, so to speak. One that is difficult to commodify, one that is difficult to objectify in a way that is easily sort of satiating to the consumer, because, you know, we, of course, have a very firm, or, you know, firm enough grasp on sex as commodity, sex selling, sex and advertisement, all of that, but pain as commodity. Pain as something being so integral to the experience that I'm capturing, that I'm communicating, but also integral to the existence of a sick body and a disabled body, and that being immensely difficult to commodify, perhaps speaking to why we have such sort of lackluster language around pain and emotionality, why we are unable to code pain as anything other than bad or something we don't want, because it's really difficult to sort of situate pain within the capitalist apparatus in a way that it makes people want to buy into it. And so then, is it an emotion worth feeling if it is not an emotion worth commodifying? And a lot of my work has always really focused on the importance of validating pain, stripping pain away from the expectations we have of it. And this goes back to what I was talking about within the body, within sort of, you know, within a BDSM context, and that relationship between the medicalized body, the bound body, the contained body, the restricted body, this sort of more abstracted relationship between pain and suffering as something that is not only inherent and sort of very, very human, something that is very accessible to, you know, anyone sort of living within a human corporeal form, whatever form that may take, but as something that should be separated from the sort of connotations that we are assigned to it because of the language that we speak. Every metaphor, you know, around pain is one that relegates to a negative sphere, to something that we want to avoid. But by thinking of a pain as something not to avoid, but as to, live with, and to build new languages around, but out of pure necessity, but also out of want and desire for that, is, sort of still a sort of radical thing, and is really integral, I think, to this new movement within crip theory that's really asking for a re-examination of everyone's relationship to pain, everyone's relationship to death, all of these things. And so the problem body embodies all of that. The disabled body embodies all of that. And it really counters, every instance within society that is asking for a conformity to pre-existing systems that dictate our desires, that dictate our preferences, that dictate the way we monitor our progress through life, the way we relate to success, the way we relate to education, the way all of these things. You break it down really simply, and you understand that the reason disability and illness is still something that is so difficult to sort of confront as a society, not just emotionally, but through legislature, through, actual infrastructure being built around disability and illness, is because at a fundamental level, we are incapable of speaking about it without chastising it, without othering it, without degrading it. And thinking about, here I've said, sort of a centralized body as opposed to the contextualized body, meaning, we are summarizing an experience and defining it as opposed to giving context and breath and life to every sort of individual experience, or at least every sort of nuanced existence that a body can go through. Again, it's an immensely difficult thing to do. Much easier said than done. I acknowledge that. But yeah, just really pushing for these new modes of thought around the body. And so I want to sort of, land now on this sculptural piece, New Artifacts, series of 11 sculptures. Again, if you haven't seen the work, please check it out on LeMag's website. There's more documentation of it than I'll share today in this PowerPoint, but here's a close-up of one of the artifacts, artifact number 11. And again, thinking about aesthetics and thinking about how we are imaging the body, new modes of imaging the body, but also expanding and compounding and like flattening all of these expectations that we have of the body to perform and to be aestheticized. And so, this piece is really sort of a conversation between the commodification of the body, the aestheticization of the body, and the sort of harrowing reality of the body as it exists as something that is dying, as something that is mortal, as something that is ephemeral, really. But isn't, in the way now that we exist in a time where existence is perceived as something that can be immortalized. But these highly sort of aesthetic objects that are representational of the body exist within that uncanny space between something that is so anatomical, can be read as so anatomical, and yet is presented as a commodity, as an object, and as something that is pure aesthetic. Yeah, and I think, again, really excited to sort of share this work with that, but to sort of, in my work, I'm so inclined to the performative and to sort of use my body as this material, but also pushing myself to expand that methodology in order to sort of encapsulate all of these, more nuanced passageways of thought that I'm encountering with. And so, my body exists within this work. The pelvis is modeled after my own pelvis, but it also is so devoid of me in a way that I'm, happy about and sort of excited about in that way. Thinking of the remnants of the body, the constructions of a body, what is a 3D printed pelvis as something that is representational. I think it's really complicated and interesting for me. So, oh, what is going on with this slide? Just a moment, let me delete that. Yes, so to return just once again to the problem body, thinking about it, the way that we classify the body, and this medical practice, this again relying on the medical and the scientific to sort of code and define how we are interacting with the body. The medical practice of dividing normal bodies from disabled bodies. And, you know, this sort of science-based power structure that bases the way we interact the body on the weight as being sort of scientifically classified within normativity or otherwise, you know, normal or other. And the problem body really represents a body that is contradictive to the normative understandings of physical existence. You know, you can really boil it down to being simply stated like that. And I think that when we sort of render or sort of understand a problem body within the hierarchies that are created around existence, you know, it breaks down the language that we have around the disabled body in a way that you can realize that we are discussing illness purely from the idea of deficiency. You know, what is the body deficient in? What is the sick body deficient in? What is the disabled body deficient in? And so when we go to then to have discussions around illness that try to break away from that, we are hitting that wall because we are discussing it as a deficit. We are discussing a lack of something. And so when we try to discuss this, the sick body and the disabled body as something existing firmly on its own, stripped away from sort of a relative existence with the able body, we realize that there is this hole missing. And so we need to fill that, you know, with expanded language, with expanded ideologies around the body. And I think that examining erotics is such an important sort of part of that, as strange as that might seem, because it speaks so distinctly about autonomy. It speaks so distinctly about the way a body relates not only to itself, but of course to those who are looking at it. And this presentation started with me saying, let's talk about looking, the act of looking. And it comes back to that again, because to look is such a distinct act, and such an act that's, again, coded with ability. You know, we think about the optics of the body, the visuals of a body, and you know, to privilege looking and to privilege sight and all these things. It's a whole nother sort of complicated layer around this, the way that language is tied into visualization. And the way that really a lot of theories around the body and around existence, if you're really delving into sort of theories of abstraction of the body and the relationship between the body and the viewer, it's coded within looking again. So finding that sort of ability and inability within the language that we're so comfortable with, and even within our own critical language. Yeah, so I think that I really have been talking and talking and talking, nonstop now. So I would really love to, if there's any questions, or to sort of open up for discussion now a little bit, Jamie, if that sounds okay.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Panteha. So we're going into our Q&A section of the program. And as a reminder, if you feel more comfortable directly asking your question to Panteha, feel free to take yourself off mute now. We do have one question in the chat that I will read out just to kick things off. Let me just scroll back up to it. The question is your work inspired by Bob Flanagan?
I wouldn't say, I'll start by saying I really admire Bob Flanagan. I think that in the discussion of sickness and disability within arts and sort of embodied illness, Bob Flanagan is such an important facet of that conversation, foundation of that conversation, really. But I wouldn't say my work is inspired by Bob Flanagan, but there's a great deal of respect for his, you know, for the life that he lived. And, you know, I'm lucky enough to know Cherie Rose, who was Bob Flanagan's mistress for the last 10 years of his life. If anyone's seen the documentary Sick, about his sort of relationship to sadomasochism, not just his relationship to sadomasochism, his devotion to sadomasochism, thinking again about, you know, the intersections between BDSM and illness. It's very interesting, you know, breaking down our expectations for what a sick and disabled body wants for itself and its relationship to pain. You know, I think, so, you know, love Bob Flanagan, so I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Panteha. I did get a question directly in the chat, which I will read out now.
Yeah.
It seems like the topics you examine in your work are so rich and layered with possibility. How much has your practice been influenced by the discourse around these issues, and how do you see it developing beyond this project?
Sorry, could you read that again? I
Yeah,
was looking at the chat. Sorry,
no
space.
worries. Uh, it seems like the topics you examine in your work are so rich and layered with possibility.
Yeah.
How much has your practice been influenced by the discourse around these issues, and how do you see it developing beyond this project?
I see. Yeah. Well, thank you, first of all, for the question. And, I think that like the critical theory and examination of that, being able to sort of like build a really sort of like grounded foundation in all of the thought that I'm working on in my work is really important to me. So it has been influenced by the bodies of thought that are happening around this, certainly, because that's the the text that I'm consuming to sort of influence my own writing and my own preparation for this. And as I said at the beginning of this work is ongoing, and it's I'm really invested in this right now. Like, this is what I'm thinking about currently as I'm moving forward. And it's really important to me to do a stronger articulation of the ways in which the histories of the disabled body as an erotic object, or the ways in which sexuality, sensuality, and eroticization has already intersected with illness and disability. I'm thinking about this now, but the disabled body as a fetish object or as a sexualized object is not a new thing. Um, just as disability and sex are not new things, their conflation certainly has a history that I'm trying to really examine. Frustratingly, a history that is sorely undocumented, and sort of difficult to find. So the question is, like, for me, that I'm answering now is like, where do I start? I'm doing a sort of extensive examination of contemporary fetish around illness, the idea of devoteeism, the idea of the sexual fetish of amputation, all of these things where disability is intersecting distinctly with fetishization and sexuality, but then also really looking for history within porn, within BDSM, of how the disabled body is used and captured, so then to sort of build a larger breadth of understanding around autonomy, or the lack thereof, of the disabled body as prop, as thing, as autonomous body. These are all things that I'm looking for actively, constantly. So not only will I be making sort of new work as I continue with this research, but I'm certainly going to be writing about it. I'm certainly going to be archiving it. It's something that is very important to me and very personally fascinating to me. I don't know how that fascination translates to the rest of the critical world, but as I'm exploring this, I realize that it is something that's super sort of unarticulated, and that's frustrating on one hand, but also very exciting on the other hand, because I'm able to sort of really work it out in a personal way as well. And all of that being considered, the sort of critical work that I'm doing around this is sort of very like scholarly approach that I'm taking to it often. Like, it's important to also acknowledge that this is a conversation that I'm also having internally. Like, what is my own relationship to my sexualization? Like, what is it that I'm trying to articulate about my simultaneous sort of like loss of ability, the worsening of my condition that I'm contending with, but also sort of that interfacing with my body being eroticized, and whether that is something that I am perceiving or actively engaging within or not. And I think that, like, having that personal discussion simultaneously with a sort of scholarly pursuit is good. I'm really appreciative of that, because I'm articulating something new to myself, and I'm always sort of hoping and trying to do that within my work. I wouldn't be making work if I wasn't also sort of pushing myself into the constant place of being uncomfortable. And so that's where this is going. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you, Panteha. Uh, does anyone have any questions they would like to ask Panteha directly? Just wanted to make sure I open up that space for everyone.
Yeah, I have one.
Oh, yes, please.
Hey, Panteha, thank you so much for doing this talk. It's really amazing. One thing you brought up was kind of like the conversations that people have about your body while you do your, like, after your performances when they're looking at your work in galleries. And I wanted to see like what parallels were between the medical spaces where your body is touched and discussed, and then the art spaces which view your body and discuss it as an art object or as the result of your performances and work.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, you know, there's an interesting dynamic between the viewer and an art object where even more sort of distinctly, I've often sometimes felt that in the medical sphere, there's an expectation for performativity within the body, even in performance work. It's like I'm making performance work, but I'm also sort of being asked to perform in a very specific, coded, sexualized way. And I think that in the art space, all of that language and the way that we're taught to interact with bodies in a medical context comes out in the way that people sort of interact with my body there, whether people realize it or not distinctly saying that people are like being so swayed by medical practice, but rather like, you know, the treatment of the disabled body as an object or like as a thing, as an aesthetic thing comes out strongly in the way that people are interacting with it as an art object. And the parallels are strong. I think that I definitely feel more control in art space because I'm not, you know, in the medical context, it's a different kind of vulnerability. It's a vulnerability that is kind of like wilding out, like it's chaotic and I don't have a grasp on it. But in the art space, it's sort of like I'm really hyper aware of that vulnerability. I'm like watching people watch me, and that's a very, very strange, dissonant feeling. But I think that the parallels are that there is an immediate sort of coding and reading of the body that then hopefully in the art space is more disrupted, whereas in the medical space it just sort of like goes on and on and on and on and on. So I really appreciate that question. I think it's a complicated thing that I am getting a better grasp on as I'm having this increased criticality in my work. It was definitely more jarring earlier on when I was presenting these pieces and having those responses, sort of eroticizing, objectifying responses to the body, because it's like I'm already objectifying myself in the work, and then you're like looking at it and objectifying me more is like overwhelming to me. But now that I'm critical of that, it's like it's exciting to me. I think it's like it's exciting to me and invigorating to me in a way that I do not feel at all in the medical space. Yeah.
Panteha, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Sherry.
Hi. It's so wonderful to see you. You know, and to hear what you have to say. Your work is it's so beautiful for me to see. You know, and I think the work that Bob and I did. Remember, we were doing that. We started doing work in 1981,
Yeah.
and at that point, the idea of male nudity was almost, you just didn't see that at all. Female bodies always. But part of what we wanted to do, we wanted to disrupt that whole idea of who is the viewer, where is the gaze, and the idea of someone being sick being an art object was sort of radical, I think, back then. And he would do things like he would read about his body, and I would have a camera and I would focus in on the parts of his body that he would be talking about. And so we really forced that whole idea of viewing the disabled, the sick body, and make that the idea that people want to be a voyeur. We sort of featured that. That was part of what we were trying to do. That was part of our idea. And to make people maybe uncomfortable, make them laugh. We used a lot of humor. Bob was so funny. I mean, amazingly funny. So, and that, I think humor sort of diffused the idea of the eroticism of it. And so I think what you're doing is an extension of that, you know, but of course it's you're being the female body that's being discussed and looked at. So, but in a sick female body. So
Yeah.
I'm very happy to see you, and you're looking beautiful and surviving this horrible pandemic.
Thank you, Sherry. It's so good to have you here. Really appreciate it.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I put it in the link, but I think I'll ask it out loud.
Yeah.
I am both a chronic illness person as well, have been my whole life. I'm there with you every minute. But I'm also the mother of a trans teen. And in the advocacy work that I end up doing, just in everyday conversation, there's so much discussion about, the actual difference between gender and sexuality.
Right.
And then so my ears particularly perked up when you talked about yourself as a minor and a disabled body.
Yeah.
Because, certainly in politics right now, we're hearing a lot of uninformed people discussing that minors should not have the authenticity to have to speak about their own bodies and what is needed for their bodies and what their things are. And so I was particularly interested in your thoughts and memory. I certainly have them, of being a disabled minor and what it's like to go through that process of learning, about speaking up for oneself as a minor, and how we can, I don't know, I think that there's sort of a larger question about how do we begin to provide and shift the mindset of what minors are capable of, I guess.
Yeah.
Lying there.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that it's really interesting bringing up this question of gender versus sexuality, especially, examining gender as in a medical scope, transness being so coded with medicalization, the expectation of medical intervention with gender is really fascinating. But, there's this interesting relationship between the idea of maturity and the sort of disabled sick minor, because you're asked from such a young age, not even asked, you're sort of forced into confronting your own mortality, the own sort of like heavy reality of your corporeality, in a way that most adults sometimes don't even have to confront until they're either confronted with it in someone that they know, or they begin sort of going through the inevitable bodily deterioration that we all face. Disability isn't something that some people experience. It's, everyone's disabled, no one's disabled. Everyone's sick, no one is sick. Sickness is inherent to the human existence. And so the immense expectation that is put on a minor, that it's put on minors to understand this, to relate to their body in such a mature way, to sort of have to deal with and accept the things that are happening to them, the decisions that are being made for them, and then the decisions that they're being invited to make. It makes it complicated when you're also thinking about the de-autonomization of children, and the way that we are also sort of stripping them of the validity and voice that they have in articulating their own existence and articulating their own decisions. It's widely acceptable for a parent to make a life-altering decision about a surgical operation that their child is going to have, but the idea of a child speaking up against that decision for themselves is taboo. It's completely unexpected, untolerated, and in the medical sphere, from the perspective of doctors, not validated at all. Only, I would say, in the past 2 years have I met sort of any sort of people in social work, in medical social work, that are really pushing to advocate for the voice of the minor in their own medical decisions. And that's the thing. That's the interesting relationship between the body as your own when it should be, and then when it's convenient for it to be your own shit to deal with, and then it being an object that is completely controlled by everyone else in the moments where people want you to be silent, sort of sit down and let what's best happen for you. And that idea of what's best for you, that being something that is never really a decision that's relegated to the sick and disabled body, especially as a minor. There's a lot of sort of complexities around the way that we code bodies as transitioning into adulthood. Is a body, is a child that is having to make decisions that will affect their lifespan, that will affect their ability that will affect their senses, you know, thinking about cochlear implants, thinking about medical prosthesis, is a body that's having these discussions, then not one that, you know, has agency in other ways. And so I think that I wish I had a more articulated answer for you, but I think that this is something we we don't have a proper framework for discussing. And you see that when you start having discussions about transness, about youth, children that are coming to these extremely enlightened decisions about their identity and about their gender and about their role and their relationship to their own body, and that is being immediately silenced. You know, you exist in your body from the day that you're born. You know, it doesn't take 18 years for you to realize, you know, to fully articulate what you want within that body. It's a ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, I've always thought, like, I remember when my child was young, like as young as, 2 and 3, I've always been an advocate for self-advocacy for my child. And I've taught my child, I was not surprised that my child was able to self-advocate and self-identify the way they were, because I'd always told them, like, you have a right to say no, you have a right to say yes to anything, right? Even things as simple as give grandma a hug, right? Like,
Yeah.
we make minors disabled by their very existence, right? By saying that they don't have the capacity. And then so many, I think that that's part of the huge shift. And that's part of why I'm bringing this up. Like, there are probably decisions you and I both would have made in our minor bodies if we'd felt that we had, right? Even much younger. And I feel so profoundly about how that changes. I mean, it's even things like when I see little kids getting their ears pierced, when they're very tiny, or circumcision. I mean, we can go anywhere with this kind of stuff about things that are done to bodies of minors, right? And I just feel like it's a much larger societal problem that we could support. It's whatever. Yes,
no, I mean,
right on.
Thank you, Carrie. Someone named Carrie just put in the chat, one of the first things we do is gender new babies. And I think it's so interesting thinking about guiding children within normativity. It's like, one, you're talking about the decisions we would have made if we even understood that we could exercise autonomy. It's like, then how do you understand that you can exercise autonomy when you're working within a system where you literally cannot? But that incessant need to project not only our conceptions of normativity onto children, who we're able to sort of influence, but this fear, this sort of hard to articulate fear of a child being non-normative. And you hear it in the discussion of children being afraid for their child coming out as trans, coming out as anything other than heterosexual, being afraid for that child, being afraid for a child that is coded as disabled, because it is moving through a world where it is going to be the subject of aggression. And so how do we contend with knowing that there is this violence built into our societal language, built into the ways that we are interacting with these bodies, while also working to sort of acknowledge that we need to be giving autonomy to the bodies that we are so afraid for, fear around illness and disability guides a lot of the ways in which the disabled body is silenced, because it's easier to silence a disabled body than to combat the fundamental structural things that are instilling us with fear for that body, And so we have these knee-jerk reactions to otherness that are very difficult to confront and even more difficult to change. But I think, having these discussions, confronting these taboos is so, so important. Oh, someone just mentioned Crash by David Cronenberg. I just rewatched that movie. For anyone who hasn't seen it, amazing. First of all, this sort of fetishization of car crashes and illnesses coming up, disabilities coming up out of that, and this sort of obsession with that which harms you, that which destroys you. Amazing film, and sort of a film that captures really well this sort of discomfort that might exist between a disabled body and its own fetishization. And yeah, I don't know, the idea of the disabled body as a maimed fetish object. Really good. Thank you, David Cronenberg. Thank you, Adam, for putting that in the chat. Really good. Yeah.
Panteha, there is
Yeah.
one other question. I just want to make sure everyone who contributed questions to the chat, we take the time to address them. There's one that just asks about what do you have to say about Frida Kahlo and if you consider her to be an influence.
Yeah, it's good. I got asked about Frida Kahlo a lot, and I think that when I was actually, interestingly, when I was younger, before I started making work, I really revered Frida Kahlo. I was sort of very fascinated with this idea of self-portraiture that is embodied illness, the idea of which is, now that I sort of have read more and seen more, I understand the sort of history of like the consumptive body in its bed, being the subject of a portrait, the beauty and death, the beauty and illness that Kahlo was working with. But I think her practice was so influential to me because there was all of these other things wrapped into it. There was an erotics within that. There is this discussion of race that she's having so often seemingly like with herself. And I really liked that because it's like Frida Kahlo, every time I looked at a painting, I felt like I was like watching her have a conversation with herself, a frustrating conversation with herself, one that I was not necessarily privy to. And so I wouldn't say that it's, to say that she's an influence in the work that I'm making now. I wouldn't say that, but I would say that in the way that from a young age, I was, trying to introduce myself to works of art that would spur this kind of thinking with me. Certainly she has been an influence in that, thinking about what you owe the viewer, Frida Kahlo really, I think, combated that always. And I really admire that. And I think that way now in my work. It's like, you can be talking about the most hyper vulnerable aspects of your life. You can be talking about, the very human secretions that your body makes, but you do not owe the viewer anything within that. You can control vulnerability, or you can, ascribe to control vulnerability as much as you want. And you can really, there is an immense amount of sort of power in creating a public display of these complex discussions within yourself. So I think Kahlo's work really always evokes that for me.
Thank you, Panteha. We have a question in the chat.
Right.
Have you thought about if there is a fetishization of documentation within your work?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that like the more I make work, the more I realize that I am like essentially exercising my own like medical fetish fantasy. Like every time I think about making a piece, I'm like, oh yeah, my like collection of like medical things that I can touch and show and like interact with. And it's like, I think that it's growing up within a medical system with like this like medical visual language so saturated within me. It's like, it makes a lot of sense that I have this like fetishistic relationship to medical paraphilia, which appears a lot in my work, but also to this practice of documentation. This idea of not just like the documentation of my own body, but the general practice of documenting the body as a sort of fetishizing gaze in and of itself. Again, I talked about this before, but in my previous talk, but the body as a series of outputs and the sort of fetishistic, like picking and choosing of what you want from a body in that way, looking at the body as data, looking at the body as outputs, looking at the body as its documentation. There's that interesting sort of depersonalized eroticization within that for sure, that I am extremely fascinated with, and that I both engage with on like a critical and like, non-critical way. I think I like allow that sort of exploration of that fetishization to come out in my work all the time. I'm very fascinated with it. But, to talk about all of this, I happy and excited to acknowledge that I definitely fetishize, the sort of medical aesthetic inherently, like, and unconsciously before I was doing it. And now I'm conscious of it because it's in my work so much, but it's like, okay, what is my relationship to medical paraphilia and like medical objects and materials that are used on me that I now connote with my body, being really critical of my own sort of fetishistic tendencies when it comes to medical stuff, and it's there. It's certainly in the work. I'm not trying to hide it. I love talking about it.
Thank you, Panteha. Before we wrap it up, I just want to make sure if anyone else has any questions that they would like to ask Panteha directly, or and thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, hi Samira.
How are you?
Good. How are you doing? Good to see you.
Yeah, my wheels are turning. So I don't know, Panteha, thank you so much for your talk today. So I don't know if this will come out as in the form of a question, but I am thinking. You're talking about the sort of medical devices and orthotics and prosthesis and the sort of like kind of binding materials and that, things like that. And this problem of the medical industrial complex really kind of imposing normalcy and normalization onto bodies, period. And to varying degrees based on ability or sort of, again, normal lookingness or normalcy. And it occurred to me looking at the documentation of your work where you're wearing all of the sort of devices that there's an interesting also kind of embedding of the racial norms into it as well, where this sort of normalizing able-bodiedness also comes with normalizing whiteness in terms of literally just on the level of the color of prosthetics. And I say this as, my mother's an occupational therapist and she makes orthotics. And growing up, I always thought as an artist, those materials were really fun because you dip it in hot water and you could bend it and all this kind of stuff. There's a range of patterns of the kind of materials that you can buy, but there is not very much a range of skin colors. So there's like a white skin color, and then you have black, like literally just black, and the range between them is very, very narrow. Anyway, so I saw that in the documentation. And so I wonder in the conversation you're having around, normalization of the body, obviously race comes into it, if there's anything to say around there in the sexualization of the body of the other that's non-white as well.
Definitely. Yeah, no, I'm so happy that you brought that up. I think that it's immensely fascinating, and it's thinking about, I'll just talk about prosthetics really quickly first as sort of like really coded, like layered coded signifiers of otherness. Because one, you are being coded as disabled, you're being coded as sort of having a literally sort of othered physical body. But then there's a othering when your skin color is at odds with the prosthetics that you're using, because it, in a strange, sort of complicated, but still very sort of simple way, it compounds your inability to adhere to the standards that are being set in place for you, even within a prosthetic that's like an othered, appendage. It's like whiteness is being conflated with this adherence to able-bodiedness that a prosthetic sort of ascribes to bring to you, whether, and then you talk about the failures of, the prosthetic to do that or not. But I think it's really fascinating because in examining otherness, and in examining the body as fetish object, race and, skin color plays so heavily into that, because I spoke so much about the languages that we speak that allow us to, like, without thinking, code a body, and race is, is so charged within that. We cannot, in this age that we're living in right now, sort of examine a body and not racialize it, and not, even with the best intentions, confine it into the scale of otherness. Where does it fit onto otherness? And then that sort of like spurs this performativity between viewer and body that is even more complex, racial performativity, and like the way we are now, the language is being constructed around what it means to like, how do you treat a body that is being racialized? How do you engage with a body that's being racialized? And, you know, there's a lot of like tiptoeing around the disabled body and the othered body. There's, you know, there's a lot of ways to discuss it where you're not actually sort of talking about the disability and the otherness. We were talking about how you feel about the disability and the otherness, how the viewer feels about that. And that intersects with race like head on, because we are operating in a way where we feel as though we are talking about racialization, otherness, fetishization, when really we're talking about why we're uncomfortable with racialization and otherness and fetishization. And the systems that we have make it really hard to allow intersectionality to happen between race and disability without the conversation really being boiled down to like, I'm uncomfortable and I don't know why, or I'm uncomfortable and it's because of these like really sort of banal reasons that I've been given, you know, through the ways in which we're sort of educating around race and disability that are very, very superficial. And so it's like, for instance, in methods of care, it's super coded to have an image of a brown body in shackles, you know, like what are the connotations of that? It's like, that's a whole different discussion, but it's like you invite in this gaze onto a body that is binding itself, racializing itself, objectifying itself. And then, you know, in that work, I'm sort of just like, and now what do you think about that? And it's immensely uncomfortable because it's like, do we begin a discussion about slavery? I don't know. You know, do we begin a discussion about the way in which the Black and brown and colored body has functioned within BDSM as, you know, the racialization, racism within fetishization, racism within groups of otherness, colorism within otherness, you know, all of these things. It's like, you know, I feel like now I could like talk for another 2 hours about this, but it's frustrating, but it's also immensely vital that, you know, we are able to like acknowledge race as it intersects with disability, because when I was earlier in past talks, when I've talked about disability specifically within institutions, within the art space, you know, we think a lot about the solutions to these problems in idealizing ways. What does it look like to create a perfectly accessible space? People have asked me before. And that's a frustrating question for me, because to create a space that is 100% disability accessible, impossibility, you know, in and of itself. But say for a moment, I indulge this hypothetical, and we do create a space that is 100% disability accessible. I'm still going to be othered when I walk through that space, because, you know, it's like, you know, it's like there's no way to strip and compartmentalize an identity. And that is what language is trying to do for us right now. It's trying to say, let's just talk about disability. Let's solve that problem first. And then we can sort of deal with the racism issue, which is like so frustrating, because it's like, it's not a disability issue, it's an otherness issue, and otherness expands itself into race. It expands itself into the whole identity of a body, into the whole optics of a body. And there's no way to examine the sort of decrepit body without also acknowledging how color is playing into that. And I could go on and on about institutionalized racism and the art space as a, you know, the museum as an institution that has its roots in colonialization. And so what is the relationship between the colonial history of the disabled body and the colonial history of the body of color? And are those two things even being allowed to intersect? And I'd say not yet, not fully, you know. I don't think that we're having articulated conversations about that.
I do think, I do want to say though, that I think that the work with the shackles that you were talking about does actually speak to that, because it creates, there's this, you talked about it in terms of capitalism as well, in the sense of labor being an interesting point of intersection between the two conversations that you're talking about being divided. But I actually think that there's something interesting here in terms of labor and the objectifying of bodies, the objectifying of the Black body in terms of labor in a colonial history, historically, and on the other end, the devaluing of the differently abled or disabled body based on its inability to produce labor. And based on its inability to participate in capitalism. So there's, I do think that image in particular was really striking to see, because it was collapsing actually these ideas. Now we're getting away from sexuality and sexualization, which is, I understand the topic of your conversation here, but I do think that the collapse happened for me in that moment where capitalism actually becomes the link and the thing that is objectifying across the spectrum and allows for all of these kinds of openings for the dehumanization of the body, and of the individual.
Yeah, thank you so much, Samara.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Jamie, I see that Carrie put in the chat, let's talk about accessibility, so many hidden disabilities. My God, like a huge can of worms, but I think that I will say that it's so interesting in, again, talking about what we expect from the disabled body, how it performs for us, how it performs for the able-bodied viewer. So fascinating that we, in one fell swoop, ask the disabled body to relegate itself to the private sphere, to hide, to feel shame. And then we also expect it to code itself. So we say, if you're disabled, I need to know that. So I know how to interact with you. So I know how to read you. So I know how to, what box to put you in, essentially. So when the topic of hidden disabilities, imperceivable disabilities comes up, people are floundering at that because we do not know how to engage with a disabled body that is not implicitly read as disabled, because disability is so tied to visual languages, visual markers of otherness that make it easy for the able body to interact with that body. And so, you speak to people who are identifying as disability, who are contending with disability every day. And when you realize that so many disabilities are hidden, quote unquote, even that word hidden, that idea that it's relegated within yourself, the privacy, again, the shame, all of that is coded within the language that we have around it. You realize how performative our current sociological and societal relationship to illness is, where it's essentially like, please show me that you're sick so I can then treat you as sick. Please show me that you're disabled so I can treat you as disabled. And a lot of most of the infrastructure that we have in terms of resources for the sick and disabled rely on visible markers of disability and illness to justify your use of these social programs, to justify your use of accessibility measures. The sick and disabled body is being asked constantly to prove its otherness while also being shamed for that otherness. It's this exhausting relationship between, again, yanking between the public and private. Please hide your disability from me so I'm not uncomfortable, but do not let me forget that you're disabled so that I may continue to other you. It's it's exhausting, but it's fascinating because it's so telling of the way that we interact with otherness in general. It's, again, the discussion can be taken into race, thinking about coding bodies as othered, coding, racializing bodies where you are expected to perform and elucidate others as to what your race is so that they may then fully understand how to code and interact with your body. But yeah, within disability, this is extremely frustrating. I see that, Rebecca, you mentioned Social Security and like applying for disability benefits. Again, that harrowing process of proving to an institution that you deserve the barely sufficient, hardly sufficient help that it's offering you. And that's the thing, is that the disabled body is fully left on its own. It's something that it is an experience that is built to be handled in full isolation. And again, the complexities of help and needing help and the way that that's so coded, but the disabled body is its own advocate and also responsible for placating itself to the able body. And so, you know, yeah, that's written into legislation, that's written into, yeah, Carrie, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, one thing I just wanted to speak to in terms of what Samara brought up and why and how I see that we got into this related topic is I think that racialized capitalism is at one of the pillars and into it, because even when stolen Africans were enslaved in this country, different than many other places in the world, like the experience became property. Right. And women, this is a time when a lot of in enslaved times, families split up because the woman had to keep producing, had a certain amount of time to produce more property. And I think a lot of so much of what happened in those early times, we still see today, as you started to say, about what's written into or what's not written into our laws. And it's very hard to pull it apart. Even though we can start to talk about one part, like your very specific topic, and I love your work, and I'm so glad to have heard you today. And there are all the ands as we start to try to pull on one part.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, it's a thread that just try to yank it out and it just unravels the whole sweater, right? But it's like this discussion obviously shows just how, as a species, but also in the West, we're operating in a structure that relies on the othering of bodies, not only on the othering of bodies, but building a foundation on bodies that we push down and relegate to objects to be used to benefit the infrastructure from which we are made to feel like we're all benefiting from. But of course, within capitalism, we know that is absolutely not the case. And so I think with race it becomes extremely complicated, because you see the ways in which racialized bodies, othered bodies, brown bodies are upholding capitalism. But within disability, it's fascinating, because the disabled othered body plays a much more sort of complicated role in the perpetuation of capitalism, in which health, the image of health, and the manufacturing of an image of a healthy body is what is perpetuating the sort of capitalist apparatus around disability, where we're able to sell the idea of the able body, the pinnacle of health, because we're able to desecrate the image of sickness and disability and say, you don't want this, you want this. And so, breaking it down into those terms is really frustrating, upsetting, but also really helpful in understanding all of the language and images that we're being fed that ultimately construct so often subconsciously within people their relationship to illness, why they're so shaken, uncomfortable by it. It does really, really come down to what you're being sold, and it's saddening, but it is fascinating,
Well, I think we're coming up on to 2:30. Thank you so much to everyone for your questions and for participating in today's program, and just massive thank you to Panteha and for sharing your insights and just the really important work that you're doing. Just thank you. And I also want to take the time to thank the Department on Disability for providing us today with our sign language interpreters, Nicole Pancino and Arthur Cosentino. Thank you. And also our captioner, Lorena Tompkins. And if you missed the beginning portion of the program, don't worry, we have you covered. We recorded it and we'll be making it available on LMAG's website by next week, as well as if you missed Panteha's first program, we did record that as well, and we will also be making that available next week. And final push, if you have not experienced Tender Calamities, please check it out. It's on LMAG's website. It's up through April 22nd, and Panteha will also be participating in one last program with the other three artists, Tristan Espinosa, Mario Garcia, and Alexander Duriz, as part of the Winter 2021 exhibition series at LAMAG. So stay tuned. We have lots of great things coming up. And just thank you all again so much for your time today, and take care, stay safe, and we'll see you virtually next time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for the amazing conversation. Thank you, Jamie. Just so much appreciation for everyone. Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Panteha. Thank you, Jamie.
Yes, good seeing you, Samira.
Yeah, of course, it's lovely to see your face.